There is a moment in every Japanese household, and I have witnessed it many times across the decades I spent studying the financial customs of my own culture, when a child, no older than 6 or 7, is handed a small wooden box. Not a toy, not a gift wrapped in celebration. A plain wooden box, lacquered perhaps, divided inside into 3 separate compartments. And before the child is allowed to hold it with both hands, an elder, a grandmother, a grandfather, sometimes a parent, sits beside them in silence for a moment, and then says one word, just one. That word is not save, it is not invest, it is not spend wisely or work hard, or any of the other phrases that American parents repeat to their children with good intentions and incomplete understanding. Those are Western approximations of something far older and far more precise. That one word spoken quietly in a Japanese home to a child who is barely old enough to read carries within it an entire philosophy of life, a philosophy that has kept Japanese families financially stable and financially dignified across centuries of war, earthquake, foreign occupation, and economic collapse. And yet, if you were to ask most Americans today, even educated ones, even disciplined ones who have spent decades trying to do the right thing with their money, they have never heard it. Not once. They were never taught it. Not because they lacked intelligence or because they lacked the desire to do well, but because no one in their life had ever received it either. The transmission was interrupted before it could begin, and that absence, that single missing word, explains more about the difference between Japanese and American financial behavior than any statistic, any government policy, or any economic theory ever could. If you have ever felt, quietly and without being able to articulate it precisely, that something fundamental was missing from the way you were taught to think about money, something that no book, no seminar, no financial advisor ever quite addressed, you were not wrong. You simply had not yet been given the word. To understand why this word carries such weight, we must travel back to a Japan that most Westerners have never studied and most history books never describe in adequate depth. Not the Japan of post-war Reconstruction or the economic miracle of the 1980s, but the Japan of the Edo period, which lasted from 1603 to 1868, 2.5 centuries of deliberate, enforced stability. The Tokugawa shogunate, which governed Japan throughout this era with absolute authority, made a decision that had no real parallel anywhere in the Western world at that time. It sealed Japan almost completely from foreign trade and foreign influence, no significant imports, no exports of consequence, no Dutch merchants beyond a single, tightly controlled trading post on an artificial island in Nagasaki harbor, no English traders, no Portuguese missionaries. The country was required, by the deliberate design of its rulers, to sustain itself entirely from within its own borders and its own resources. What historians who study this period carefully understand, and what is almost never discussed in Western financial literature, is that this enforced closure did not produce poverty or stagnation. It produced something entirely different. It produced one of the most sophisticated internal economies the world had ever seen, built on the management of limited resources with extraordinary precision and extraordinary patience. While the merchants of Amsterdam were speculating on tulip futures and collapsing entire financial systems in a single season, and while the traders of London were financing colonial extraction across 3 continents, the merchant families of Edo and Osaka were doing something that no one in the West was watching and no one in the West would record. They were developing a philosophy of money that was entirely inseparable from a philosophy of life, of character, and of time. In Osaka, known throughout the Edo period as the kitchen of Japan, the commercial and financial heart of the entire country, there existed a class of merchants called the chonin. This is important to understand. The chonin were not aristocrats. In the rigid Confucian social hierarchy that structured Edo society, merchants occupied the lowest formal rank, below samurai, below farmers, below artisans. They were considered by official ideology to be parasitic, people who moved goods without producing them. And yet, within 2 or 3 generations of the Edo period's establishment, the Chonin merchant families of Osaka had accumulated wealth that rivaled and in many cases exceeded that of the samurai class above them. The Mitsui family, whose commercial operations began in the 1640s under the founder Takatoshi Mitsui, is perhaps the most documented example. Takatoshi had studied the financial customs of Kyoto's established merchant families before opening his dry goods store in Edo, and he brought with him a set of household financial principles that he codified in private family documents as the foundation of the Mitsui household's conduct. By the time Commodore Perry's ships arrived in Japanese waters in 1853 and forced Japan to reopen to foreign trade, the Mitsui house had already operated as a unified, disciplined financial institution for over 2 centuries. They had survived regional famines that bankrupted neighboring merchants. They had survived the catastrophic fires that periodically destroyed entire districts of Edo. They had survived the political turbulence of the late Edo period when the power of the Tokugawa shogunate began to fracture. How? Not through luck, though luck certainly visited them. Not through political connection alone, though they cultivated those connections carefully. But through an internal code, a set of principles transmitted within the family from elder to child in the private hours of the evening that governed how the household related to money at the most fundamental level. Similar household codes existed in the Sumitomo family, whose origins trace back to a copper merchant in Kyoto named Masatomo Sumitomo in the early 1600s, and in the Konoike family, whose banking and shipping operations made them among the wealthiest individuals in all of Edo period Japan. What these families shared was not a secret investment strategy. What they shared was a way of teaching their children before those children were old enough to enter any school or academy, a specific orientation toward money that was different in its most basic assumptions from anything developing simultaneously in the West. And that orientation began with one word, spoken to a child holding a wooden box. The samurai class, the bushi, had their own relationship with financial reality during this period, one that is frequently misunderstood in Western romanticizations of the warrior code. The samurai were not wealthy in the way that Chonin merchants were. They received rice stipends from their lords, the daimyo, and for much of the mid and late Edo period, those stipends remained fixed while the cost of daily life quietly and persistently rose. Many samurai families were, according to domain household records that historians have since examined, in a state of chronic and quiet financial strain, maintaining the external appearance of honor and social rank while managing genuine scarcity behind closed doors. What they developed as a result of this constraint was remarkable, a practice of navigating severe limitation with absolute dignity and without the public acknowledgement of difficulty. They did not borrow beyond what they could repay, because dishonor attached to unpaid debt in a way that had no equivalent in Western commercial culture. They did not display what they did not own. And they taught their children, according to records maintained in several domain archives, that the relationship between a person and their financial life was a direct mirror of that person's inner character. A man's soul could be read, they believed, in how he handled scarcity, not how he handled abundance. Anyone could appear noble with abundance, but how he conducted himself when there was not enough. This samurai financial philosophy and the merchant philosophy of the Chonin were, in many respects, opposites in their social context. But they shared a single foundational assumption, that money is not merely transactional, it is relational. It is the expression of who you are in time. The word at the center of everything I am describing, the word spoken to Japanese children before age 7, is Tameru. But I must be precise because the word alone is not the teaching. The phrase that was transmitted within Edo merchant households and that I first encountered in my own family from my grandfather who had studied these traditions was this, Tameru me ni kangaru, which translates in its most direct English form as think before you accumulate. But that translation already loses the essential texture of what the Japanese conveys. In the original language, Tameru does not simply mean to save or to store. It carries within it the image of water gathering slowly and deliberately in a vessel, with full awareness of the vessel's capacity, the water's source, and the purpose for which it is being gathered. It implies not passive accumulation, but conscious, intentional relationship with what comes into your possession. And mainikangaru, think before, does not refer to hesitation born of fear or anxiety. It refers to a specific act of prior consciousness, a moment of genuine reflection that precedes every financial decision, large and small. The thinking comes before the reaching. The awareness comes before the action. Always, without exception. And this sequence, thought, then action, when practiced from the age of 5 or 6, does not remain a rule. It becomes a reflex, and a reflex, unlike a rule, does not require willpower to maintain. Here is why this works at a psychological level that Western financial culture has never fully grasped. The entire architecture of modern Western consumer finance is built on a single assumption, that the default human state is wanting, and that financial discipline is the effortful exception to that wanting. Credit systems, installment plans, revolving debt, advertising, retail design, all of it is engineered around the understanding that human beings will act on impulse and attempt to correct afterward, and that this correction will be partial and temporary. Western financial advice, therefore, is largely corrective in nature. It tells you what to do after you have already acted on impulse. Budget your spending. Track your purchases. Cut your subscriptions. These are all reactive tools for a reactive financial identity. Tameru ni Kangaeru does something fundamentally different. It does not correct the impulse after the fact. It places a moment of stillness between the impulse and the action, a moment so habitual, so practiced, so deeply embedded in identity that it operates without effort. The pause is not a wall. It is a door. You still pass through it, but you pass through it deliberately, knowing why you are going and what you expect to find on the other side. This principle is related to, but importantly distinct from, the concept of Kaizen, which many of you already know as the philosophy of continuous incremental improvement that transformed Japanese manufacturing after the Second World War. Kaizen, as a formalized concept, emerged from the industrial world of the 1950s, but its philosophical roots in Japanese domestic life are centuries older. The practice of Tameru ni Kangaeru is, in its deepest sense, Kaizen applied to financial consciousness. Each individual pause, each small moment of prior reflection before a spending decision, is in itself almost meaningless. One pause saves you almost nothing. But 10,000 pauses, practiced consistently across decades, do not merely save you money. They build a different person. A person whose financial life reflects intention rather than impulse. A person who knows at any given moment why they have what they have and why they chose not to acquire what they did not acquire. There is a Japanese proverb that speaks directly to this process. Ishi no ue ni mo sanen. Sit on a cold stone for 3 years, and even the stone will grow warm. Patience applied with intention transforms what patience alone never could. The wooden box with 3 compartments was the physical embodiment of this teaching. Japanese children in merchant households were taught, from the first moment they received any money at all, to divide it before doing anything with it. 1 portion for present need, 1 portion for near future need, 1 portion for the unnamed future, the uncertainty that will certainly arrive even if its shape cannot yet be seen. This is not a budgeting system in the Western sense. It is not a spreadsheet or a percentage allocation model. It is a physical, embodied act of prior consciousness that teaches the child, through their hands, through repetition, through the presence of an elder watching quietly, that money in your possession is never simply yours to spend. It is already in relationship with time. It already belongs in part to versions of yourself that do not yet exist. To spend all of it now is not freedom. It is a kind of theft from your own future. If you have ever genuinely wondered why this principle, so elegant, so psychologically sound, so clearly effective across centuries of Japanese financial history, never became part of Western financial culture, you are asking exactly the question that matters. And the answer, when you examine it carefully, reveals something important not about individual failure, but about structural difference. The Edo period ended in 1868 with the Meiji Restoration, when Japan made the decision, or more accurately, when Japan was forced by external pressure into the decision, to open itself to Western influence and to modernize at extraordinary speed. The Meiji government sent scholars to Europe and America. They imported legal systems, industrial techniques, military organization, and central banking structures, and Japan, within a single generation, transformed itself from a feudal society into a modern industrial nation. It was one of the most remarkable accelerations in human history. But in that process, something very specific occurred. Japan imported Western economic structures, and in exchange, it exported to the West its cultural aesthetics, its art, its design sensibility, its philosophy of minimalism and form. What it did not export, because there was no mechanism to export it, was the private domestic financial wisdom of its merchant families, the wooden box, the evening teaching, the whispered phrase passed from grandfather to grandchild in the quiet of a family home. These things were never in any document the West could access. They were not in any treaty or trade agreement. They were in the kitchens and the interior rooms of families who had no idea that what they considered ordinary household practice was, from the outside, entirely invisible. While the merchants of Amsterdam speculated and the financiers of London expanded, the Chonin families of Osaka and Edo were passing something through their hands in the dark that no foreign observer ever thought to record. At the same time, Western consumer culture was accelerating in precisely the opposite direction. The post-World War II American economy was constructed, deliberately by policy and by design, around consumption as the engine of growth. The returning soldier was encouraged to buy a home, fill it with appliances, drive a new automobile. Gross domestic product became the measure of national health, and gross domestic product grew fastest when people spent. Saving was patriotic during the war. After the war, saving was quietly repositioned in the cultural narrative as the enemy of progress. Advertising became the dominant language of American culture. The installment plan, which had existed in limited form before the war, expanded dramatically into a philosophical statement. Your future self is a resource that your present self can borrow against without consequence. This is the precise inversion of Tameru mai ni kangeru. In the Japanese model, the future self is something you protect, prepare for, and refuse to exploit for present comfort. In the American consumer model as it developed through the second half of the 20th century, the future self is collateral. Neither system produced its outcomes because individuals within it were morally superior or inferior. Both systems were the product of deliberate cultural construction, economic policy, and the accumulated weight of transmitted assumptions. But one of those systems left families more stable across generations, and one of them left a great many good and intelligent and hard-working people arriving at their 60s with less financial security than they deserved and a quiet sense that something had gone wrong that they could never quite name. Now, here is what matters. Not what went wrong, but what is available now. If you are in your late 50s or 60s or early 70s, you have something that the 7-year-old Japanese child receiving the wooden box does not yet have. You have the full context of your own financial life. You know what the impulse decisions cost you. You know what the pauses, when you manage them, saved you. You have decades of data about your own patterns. The Japanese merchant families understood that a mature student, someone who came to wisdom with lived experience rather than just youth, was not a lesser student. In many traditions within the Edo merchant culture, The elder who chose to change their household's financial practices late in life was respected above the young person who simply inherited good habits. The choice is more meaningful than the inheritance. Here is how to begin practicing Tameru mae ni kangairu in your life as it is right now, without dramatic overhaul and without promises you cannot keep. Begin with the physical division. 3 accounts, 3 envelopes, 3 jars, whatever is practical for your situation. The specific containers matter far less than the act of dividing before you spend. Any money that arrives, income, dividends, a check from an unexpected source, divide it physically before allocating any of it, even if the proportions seem almost trivial at first. The division is not about the amounts. The division is the practice of the pause made physical. Next, establish a personal weighting threshold. For any non-essential purchase above an amount you define, perhaps $100, perhaps $50, you wait a fixed period before completing the purchase. 24 hours at minimum, 72 hours for larger decisions, not because you cannot afford it, not out of deprivation, but to confirm, after the initial energy of wanting has passed, that the desire remains and reflects genuine intention. You will discover that some desires disappear entirely within hours. They were impulse, not preference. The desires that remain after the waiting period are real. Those are the purchases that reflect who you actually are, not who the advertisement told you to be for 30 seconds. And finally, introduce a brief daily reflection, 5 minutes, no more, in which you consider one financial decision from that day and ask yourself simply, did the thinking come before the action or after? No judgment, only attention. Attention, directed consistently and without drama, is the beginning of identity change at any age. There is something I want you to hold as we close this teaching, and I want to offer it not as encouragement in the shallow sense, but as a precise observation. The fact that you sought this out, that you already suspected the Western financial narrative was incomplete, that you felt the pull of a different and older way of thinking about money and time and character. That is not an accident of mood or a passing curiosity. That is a quality of mind that has always been in you. You were always the kind of person who looked for the deeper pattern. The system in which you lived did not offer you this pattern when you were young. That is not your failure. That is the nature of a system that was not designed with your long-term peace as its primary purpose. What you were missing was not discipline. You had discipline. What you were missing was the specific word, the specific orientation that makes discipline unnecessary because it has become identity. The merchants of Osaka did not sustain their families across 2 centuries because they were more intelligent than Western merchants or more naturally frugal. They sustained them because they taught their children, before the world got loud enough to teach them otherwise, that money is a mirror. What you do with it shows you, and shows the world, who you are in relation to time. And who you are in relation to time determines, across decades, what remains when the noise settles. That is not a small idea dressed in simplicity. That is a complete philosophy made small enough to fit in a child's hands, in a wooden box, in a quiet room, before sleep. You now have the word. The question that remains, and it is the question we will take up in the next teaching, is what the Edo merchants called bunsen. The art of distributing what you have accumulated across channels that protect it not from markets, but from the most dangerous thing of all, which is your own certainty about the future. That teaching goes deeper still, and I believe you are ready for it.